Okay. I have the pleasure of chairing this session, and especially since it is the last session of the day, so we will try to make it very, very long. So let me start. We have two distinguished speakers, Dr. Abla Abdel Latif and Dr. Leila Baghdadi. And I think between them, I've seen their emails. Dr. Leila was going to start. So let me, I will introduce them very quickly because I know you all know them. Actually, I should introduce myself. Most of you don't know me. Well, Dr. Abla is the Executive Director and Director of Research of the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. And she is also the chair of the Presidential Advisor Council for Economic Development. And I have a very, very long list of achievements that she has achieved, which I will not read because I'm sure you all know. Dr. Leila Baghdadi is the Professor of Economics at the University of Tunis, and she also holds the World Trade Organization chair at that university. So let me now ask Dr. Leila to start right away. Please, Dr. Leila.
Thank you, Dr. Ghanem. I would like also to thank the organizers, FDL, ERF, for giving us the opportunity to work on this very timely work for our country, and for the ERF team for dealing with all the steps during the last month. This work is co-authored with Professor Labidi, and it benefited substantially from the advices and support of Professor Nabi that we thank sincerely. We titled our work Public Debt Growth and Stabilization in Tunisia, a New Narrative for Structural Reform Agenda, and you know why we did that in the following. During the last decade, Tunisia witnessed a very high political instability and major macroeconomic disequilibria. And today, we have the 5 drivers of public debt and sustainability in action. We have an increasing primary deficit, around 4.5% of GDP in 2022, current account deficit reaching 9.4% of GDP in 2022, decline foreign exchange reserves, anemic growth expected around 1.3% 2023, following IMF forecast, and deterioration in the interest rate and growth differential. All this, of course, ended by high public debt, and given the high pressure on the Tunisian economy, the government was looking to come up with an IMF deal during the last, during the last 3 years, but still we don't know. There is a lot of uncertainty about and doubts about if we will reach such a deal or not. Actually, there are lukewarmness from both sides, the IMF and the Tunisian government. The IMF, because Tunisia failed during the last decade to and for 2 programs with the IMF to implement the proposed reforms because of several problems, and we'll see them later. And the Tunisian government is fearing that the reforms proposed and the austerity measures in particular will be too harmful to the population, and it fears a high political and social tensions in the country. Actually, the president of Tunisia, Kais Saied, 4 weeks ago said that the IMF agreement was too difficult, and we will do it without it. Then just to say, then we don't know. Anyhow, this question of with or without an IMF is not only political debate, it's not only public debate, it's something present daily on the Tunisian lives. Every day we are talking about this, and we are asking ourselves what will happen to us. And this is exactly the objective of this work. we want to write down, black on white, on a paper, visualizing what will happen if we have an IMF deal, without an IMF deal, but we are actually going further, while identifying two paths, a business as usual path and a new narrative, something else. Let's imagine another path that gets us out of this trap. Let me first give you some elements about the rising of the public debt. Then, as I said, the main outcome of what we lived during the last decade is a rising of public debt, that it's almost doubled during the last decade, and it's driven mostly by external debt, which is also doubled, and less by the domestic debt, but the trend changed a bit after 2019 because we break it with the agreement with the IMF broke up, actually by the Tunisian government, and since 2019 we had less external funding and the government recourse to domestic funding. Then we can see from 2019 there is an increase in the domestic public debt. For the external debt, we need to look at this in order also to construct our scenario. Then for the external financing, the external debt, the main sources are first the multilateral financing, up to 54% in 2021, then international financial market, but declined lately because we can't access to this market anymore, then up to 21%, and then bilateral financing up to 18% in 2022. Then here what we can conclude for our scenario is that the budget financing is more or less in 2022 up to 1.8 billion without the IMF agreement in the last year. Then we can see that still we access a little bit to some outside money. And second, we have this kind of constant external funding for targeting project financing around 400 million per year. For the domestic debt, it is funded mainly by the medium and long-term treasury bills, around 46% 2021. Then by treasury operation, which is between 29% to 40% during the period. But lately, the government recourse to another type of debt, which is short-term debt and currency, foreign debt, actually domestic debt in foreign currency. Here again, we can do three conclusions. Well, there is some room, small, but room to domestic debt. The main instrument available is treasury bills and bonds, and there is a huge constraint on the use of treasury to mobilize domestic resources. With all this, we have several risks on the Tunisian economy, very low growth potential because of low level of savings and investment, a decline in population growth rate, weak institutional governance, but one major risk is the blockage, the status quo of the political system, and we witnessed various external shocks, and we have seen that actually the Tunisian economy is not resilient enough, and also the population is very vulnerable to these external shocks. Now, using this characteristics of public debt in Tunisia, we are trying to figure out scenarios. Then we envision two tracks. First track, business as usual approach. In this first track, we envision two paths, two scenarios. First one, the government will say, we don't need, as the president said, we don't need the IMF. Well, we have done well during the last 3 years. We were able to survive with the IMF. Why not continue like this? Okay, then let's see this possibility. if you are doing that and continuing on the trend of the last 3 years, it means, of course, we are extremely constrained on the external financing. Then we will have access to some money for project and targeted finance, no access to international financial market. We have a limited budget finance, around $1 billion per year. On the domestic finance, very constrained by the treasury, 0.2% of GDP. However, limited access to bonds, etc., domestic bonds. While in this situation, the problem lies on the balance of payments for one reason. We have to pay, the Tunisian government needs to pay an estimated debt in foreign currency around 30,000 million dinars, Tunisian dinars, from May to December 2023. However, in terms of net assets in foreign currency, we have only 22,000 million dinars. Then unless external inflows of foreign currency, there is a gap here. And given this, we are saying most likely we'll have a balance of payment crisis starting 2024, end of 2023. With this, we are using, of course, the debt sustainability analysis framework, and we are trying to have some, to think about some assumption, real economy assumption, fiscal sector. Here, just to quickly describe this, we are envisioning a very sluggish growth, high inflation rate at the end of 2027, around 18%, and depreciation of the exchange rate around 29%. And in terms of primary fiscal deficit, the government will try to reduce it, but not that much, will end up by minus 2% of GDP. With this, what is the results of such scenario is it's a unsustainable public debt. And here we are not taking in consideration the debt of public enterprises. It will be a lot higher. Here we will end up in 2027 with a ratio of public debt over GDP by 111.5% in 2027. But again, we will not reach that side. In the meantime, already in 2024, we'll have what we are experiencing now, but more acute difficulties in shortage and difficulties in supplying the market, disruptive of productive capacities, social instabilities, because we'll have higher employment and poverty. The informal sector will expand. We have also a huge problem on the financial sector and the higher exposure of banks to sovereign risk and acute cash flow difficulties. This is scenario A, unsustainable, and we cannot do it unless there is another source, external funding. Now scenario B, with an IMF agreement, but actually what I would call it is je t'aime moi non plus. I don't know if I love you, IMF, or not at all. In this scenario, it is also business as usual. Then we come up with some agreement, with some reforms, and we say we'll do these reforms, but actually at the same time we think that there is a lot of austerity, or we don't have enough adherence from a wide-based support from the society, then we are not able to do it, and we'll break up again with IMF end of 2024. And we'll come back to scenario A. In this scenario, again, we'll have, we will have the IMF funding. What is now in the pipeline, I mean, $1.9 billion, and then per year, 500 million per year. And we have some support, more than scenario A, at least for the first year, 2.5 billion per year, and some project finance. However, beginning from 2025, we'll come back to scenario A. However, this scenario could be even more dangerous than scenario A, because we'll see the results. But here again, we'll have sluggish growth, but eventually we can go up to 1.8% 2027 inflation rate, because we are not using that much the domestic funding, we can eventually come up at the end of 2027 with 8%, and the depreciation will not be too high. However, in terms of primary fiscal balance, because we are not doing the reforms, we are not really improving it. Then, with this scenario at the end, we'll have, again, an unsustainable public debt. A ratio of public debt over GDP is 94.4%, unsustainable. But we think that this scenario is even more dangerous because we'll lose all credibility to do anything. The position of the donors will be even more tough and difficult, it will be more hardened. And there is a revision of budget support funding in the medium and long run. Here, at the domestic level, people will not also will not trust the government anymore. And there will be even more resistance to reforms. And the recourse to domestic finance, it will be like scenario A. However, we think that it will create even more difficulty for the country. Now, we are trying to, in the second path, we try to imagine another path. What will be the path or the track to get back the debt to a sustainable path? And we do think that actually we need to imagine a novel approach, a new narrative, something that will force people or attract people to adhere to reforms. For this, we need to acknowledge why the Tunisian government and all the governments that hold power were not able to do reforms. We don't think they are stupid. We think that there are serious problems in Tunisia to implement reforms, but there are also other problems that other countries at the global level encounter. For Tunisia, we need to acknowledge that there is a strong social and political resistance to reform. This is something true, and we need to look at, to face it. On the political level, on the global level, we know that there is a complex relationship between growth and austerity. And we also need to acknowledge that, and we need to keep it in our focus while we are trying to think about reform. First, for the Tunisian economy, while we had democratic transition with a high cost and a cycle of political and social instability. With that, we have strong resistance to reforms with several groups, and no group would like to bear the cost of reforms. Actually, they don't want to have reforms. They would like to even, secure their position. Also, we need to acknowledge that there is a lack of resilience to non-economic shock, and we are facing population highly fragile, vulnerable. And without acknowledging that, and without having a system of support to this population, we cannot go forward. Now, on the growth austerity nexus, there is a problem also of, dosing things. Then there is first a sequencing issue. We know that you need to prioritize things, because if we succeed to do the biggest reform or good reforms the first year with some tangible outcomes, maybe you can do other reforms. Then there is a problem of sequencing. Then there is problem also of approach. We need to break down with this accounting approach and identify expenditure from revenues. Then there is also this cost sharing issue. Who will bear the burden of the reforms? And we need to have something equitable between the different groups. And then there is this problem also of adherence to reforms. Without wide-based support, well, it's difficult to have your package of reform going forward. With that, we tried also to imagine what we need, what are the building blocks to have, and the prerequisites to have a successful fiscal consolidation. For us, we can see three building blocks. We need first to have the return of the rule of law. With that, we need to have the political stability. And then this is a condition for the government to implement the reforms. But first, this government needs to have a strategic vision and to kind of share it effectively with the wide base actors. What is really important is to, again, get the interest of citizens, of civil society, and will trust you and think that you are actually able to do such a reform, which is not the case today. Once we envision that, we think that the reform should, in order to attract this confidence, it should turn around 4 things. First, again, restore confidence, which is the first thing to do, and the most important reform should fall under this restore confidence. These are the prior reforms to do in the first, second year, and then improve the quality of public services to have greater adherence from citizens and civil society. And then, because we acknowledge that there is a problem of resilience and vulnerability from the population, it's really important to focus on energy and environmental security and food security. With that, for every pillar of reform, the government do have several instruments: fiscal policy, monetary policy, innovation, and of course rules and regulation. And for each reform, the government can use each of this. In this study, we acknowledged also there is a problem of social contracts, and there is a need to change the social contract. However, and this is a limit, we are unable today to imagine what is the new social contract. However, we know that we are in process of transition toward a new social contract, and we are trying to put it here on the paper. The old social contract, just to do it briefly during the last decade, it's basically political level. We have only one leg, political level consolidation of the democratic transition, but marginalizing the economic issue. And here we have 3 main actors: the government, political parties, and civil society. Each one actually don't want to go a step further and preferring to stay on the comfort zone and securing its interest. It breaks it down, it's not possible anymore. We are forced now to think about a new social contract, but here today we are in transition period. And we have now 2 legs: political level, economic level. And the political level, what is absolutely important is to avoid the populism, basically on both levels, and trying to restore the democratic transition. We have doubted if we can do it during the medium term, but still we are putting there. Second, set the country on the path of economic reform, and here we think that this is really a priority. We don't have today the space, actually. We don't have anymore the space to doing the democratic thing without thinking about the economy. For this, today it's blocked, and we need maybe something, an intermediate economic and social dialogue or council that kind of frame this reform that we need to implement. Now, I'm talking about the reforms under the 3 pillars: restoring confidence, improving the quality of public service, energy, environmental security, and food security. For each pillar of reforms, we thought about formal sector, national administration, fair competition, then democratizing the private sector, and renewing the Exchange Control Regulation Act. We are also putting a focus, but maybe later during the period, on the energy and environmental security, where we're looking to greening fiscal policy, and many projects actually, they are on the pipeline of the government about good governance in the hydrocarbon sector and accelerating renewable projects through public-private projects. Then here we have the instrument. I will go quickly. then the fiscal policy, monetary policy, innovation, and we tried for every reform to think what are the policies we can use. Okay. Then, for this scenario, with this reform, we think that there is an improvement of growth, but the end of the period, not at the beginning. Not in 2023, maybe beginning from 2024, maybe later, but here we are just hypothetical. And we also have some external financing hypothesis, then still the same IMF financing. What is different from the other scenarios that we can access eventually to the international financial markets in 2026. But here in this scenario, there is limitation in terms of domestic financing, then limiting banking exposure to sovereign risk. In this scenario, and I'm here, maybe it's Dr. Alia, you were speaking about the scenario with a higher growth. Here in this scenario, we're thinking about something with higher growth. At the end of the period, once we are doing the project, we did the simulation exercise actually to see what are the outcomes in terms of growth. And here we can go to up to 7.9% 2027, lower inflation rate, and primary fiscal balance that can be positive only at the end of the period. Here we are putting together scenario A, B, and C, and you can see that only with scenario C, with this higher level of growth, we can get back to a sustainable path in terms of debt over GDP. Doing the business as usual will only end with high risks to the economy and the tensions, and we saw the different risks that are holding. To conclude, here, what we are trying to share with you, that we need to break up with an accounting approach of fiscal consolidation, that we need a new reform approach, new lenses that place greater importance to improve citizen support for fiscal consolidation, to break up with the resilience to programs that will only increase the resilience for economic shock, and to acknowledge that resilience for non-economic shock also matter, to have the adherence of the society and the citizens, and to break up also with an austerity that associate investment spending with as an adjustment variable, and look at more as a lever for potential growth. Here, scenario A and B, or the business as usual scenario, what Tunisia is doing during the last decade is limited, and more than that, we are going to a wrong path, to highly unsustainable path with many risks on the economy and society, and we wanted to put it on paper.
Thank you very much.
We also want to think that scenario C.
I thought you were concluding, Dr. Leila.
Yes, I'm done. It's okay.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for this very useful presentation. And let me go right away to Dr. Abdel.
Okay. Yes. Hello, everyone. This is the very last presentation. Standing between you and the end of the day is worse than standing between you and lunch. So this is really as hard as it gets. Okay.
Lunch is very important.
Lunch is very important. All right. Well, I hope that my presentation is not going to be boring and you're not going to fall asleep. Hopefully. Okay. Let me start, first of all, by mentioning the research team that's working. I'm the team leader, and I have members from my research center, the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies, that we have worked together for this study. I'm going to talk about all of these things, but I'm really going to go through them very quickly. Okay, I'm going to mention, first of all, the objective of the study. I'm going to go a quick surf through Egypt's macroeconomic dashboard from 2011 to date, and really quick surf, so you can see yourself surfing in the sea. The vicious circle of poor economic performance, what do we mean by that? What does it imply? The present crisis situation, what it means, the dangers, the repercussions, what is the expected near future best and worst scenario, and the conclusions of that, and moving on to evidence-based analysis for institutional reform as being the correct and only way out of the mess that we are in right now, and the suggested approach to this reform and the immediate emergency plan needed as being suggested. So I'm going to go through all this in 15 minutes, leading to the optimistic if scenario. The context, of course, you already know. This is country number 6 in the study. What is meant, or what the objective of the Egyptian case, okay, is twofold: to analyze the real state of affairs, what's happening, and suggest the way out of the crisis. Very important. The starting premise of the study is actually the point that Dr. Alia mentioned before, right? That yes, what is happening in Ukraine, yes, COVID-19 has a lot to do, has some to do with what we're facing, but the reality is we've had these problems way long before, okay? And they've been repeated, and we're always coming back to them, and this means that the roots of it, okay, are still not reached, okay? So we've been featuring the very same problems of persistent debt burden, large budget deficit, limited export, among others, repeatedly, way before all those recent shocks. And this means, by the way, that right away that the search needs to go deeper, and there is a lot more to it than meets the eye. The quick surf, okay? Yeah, Dr. Ibrahim, النبي خليك. Doctor. ما بعرفش أتكلم والback ground here. Sorry, excuse me. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. First of all, there's a very weak economic growth with clear fluctuations, okay, through this period. Our GDP is mainly driven by low productivity sectors from the supply side, and consumption from the demand side. Investment is dominated by public investment. There is a decreasing trend for the private investment. You can see the curve over there. And the public investment is going for oil, energy, construction, real estate, and transportation. These are the things that are actually taking it all. The debt interest payments alone, they account for over 30% of the government expenditure, followed by the public investment, which is increasing from one year to the other. So these are a bunch of pieces forming a puzzle that show you the picture. The expenditure on education and health as a percentage of GDP is lagging behind the constitutional requirements, and it's a lot lower than previously. And there is an increased percentage of people below the poverty line, and even the ones that are higher than the poverty line are not exactly in a good condition. Budget deficit is decreasing as a percentage of GDP, but with indications of shrinkage of economic activities and decrease in necessary expenditure. And really here we have to stop. The expenditure is going down. It's the red curve, but the revenues are really not increasing. So we do have a decrease in the budget deficit, but it's nothing to be happy about, because it's not happening with an increasing economy, with an active economy. The economy is shrinking, and the expenditure on basic things like education, health, and so on are actually going down. The primary deficit, which is actually, I know that IMF loves it, but I hate it, okay, because I think it's an accounting myth, is increasing, but it is useless if it's increasing while the cost is actually a shrinking economy. And but what is more dangerous, that the increase in the primary surplus is actually making the government look at it as an end in itself and not look at the rest of the story, which this is really the bigger problem. The debt situation is not good. The debt has been increasing significantly. All our 3 indicators, all IMF 3 indicators, are outside the safe zone. Whether we're talking about the percentage of GDP, which is now around even 40%, or whether we're talking about external debt as a percentage of exports, or the debt services as a percentage of the export revenues. The 2 other indicators have always been ignored on the side, looking at the percentage of GDP, debt as a percentage of GDP, being within the safe zone and saying, but we're okay. We were not okay, and we still aren't. And the reliance on short-term debt is actually increasing. We've been managing the exchange rate mainly using the reserves. Okay, we've been fixing it very nicely. Okay, and using up the reserves in order to protect the pound and make sure that the price of the dollar does not increase. There is an increasing gap between the formal market and the black market exchange rate since June 2022. That is actually very, very visible. They were close a little bit after signing the IMF program. Then after that, the gap started to increase again. We're having our worst inflationary periods ever, our inflation reaching 40% monthly. Our projected debt obligations in the next few years are 20 billion yearly for the next 3 years. So we owe 60 billion in the next 3 years alone. Okay? And then after that, the pressure is going to become a bit less. The net portfolio outflows has been going on and is continuing, and it's a problem because we've been relying on hot money a lot more than we should. The net international reserves are decreasing, and with a high percentage actually accounted for by deposits. The credit rating has been going down, okay, by Fitch, by Moody's, and more recently by Standard & Poor's. Our future outlook was stable. It also became negative. Okay, what is happening? There is a vicious circle of poor economic performance that has been going on even before 2011. Okay, what is this vicious circle? We have been relying very heavily in the way we deal with our economy on fiscal and monetary policies. Solutions to all problems come from those two toolboxes, specifically the exchange rate and the interest rate. Okay, typically there is pressure. We stay until this pressure takes an extreme, and then we make a sudden devaluation. Okay, which becomes unavoidable because the economy becomes almost paralyzed. Okay. And then after a while, okay, we keep managing the economy in exactly the same way, so the problem gets repeated again. So the repeated scenario proceeds as follows: temporary relief of the problem, then shortly after, in the span of approximately 10 years or less, and less is what we're observing now, the unavoidable downturn of the economy takes place again, and the old symptoms re-emerge. Okay? The overpriced currency, the accumulated debt, okay? And along with that come the persistent chronic problems in Egypt, the high unemployment, the limited investment, the over-reliance on imports, the high trade deficits, the human investment levels, the spending is very low, etc., etc. And being a rentier economy does not help. Okay, it makes this vicious circle even more vicious, and our over-reliance on hot money and our focus on big projects, okay, made it vicious. Okay. So, and this is showing actually the vicious circle, you know, the shock, the shortage, the overvalued exchange rate, okay, the quick solution, and then we go back to it again. All right, what is the present situation? Okay, what is happening? We have alarming economic indicators. We have a foreign exchange gap of about $23 billion. We have an increasing gap between the official and the black market exchange rate price. We have reserves reaching $34 billion, 28 billion of which are Gulf deposits. We have high inflation, as I said. We have serious shrinkage in private sector activities and in foreign direct investment, which is actually observed. And we have a decrease in what we get from labor remittances, which is actually our biggest source of foreign exchange. We have an increase in tourism revenues, but it's far from being able to compensate what is happening. This is showing the increasing gap which I mentioned before. We also see that on top of that, we also have the huge debt obligations. Okay, we have for the next 3 years, $63.8 billion, and the debt situation is very tough. We observe alarming policy direction, and this is important. Okay, we already, unlike Tunisia, we already signed an agreement with the IMF, but we are not really complying with the agreement yet. We are going very, very, very slowly. Okay, and this is a problem, and this is resulting in delayed review. We are continuing with our mega projects as planned. Okay, in spite of the situation. We have abrupt increases in taxes, in fees, in gas, in electricity prices, okay, that are happening even though the economy is actually having serious problems and is very slow. The new announced government budget for the fiscal year 23-24 is put and set in the same traditional way, okay, with the targets, with the targeted primary surplus of 2.5%, with growth of 4%. It's prepared in the exactly same traditional way, nothing different in coping with the present situation, and without explaining its philosophy or sources of revenue or the logic of the expenditure. And the public media is always trying to make the picture look better than its reality. And we still have heavy involvement of the army and other security authorities in the economy, in the activities. The dangers of that, of course, there is the loss of trust in the Egyptian economy, the paralysis of the productive sectors because of delayed clearance of components in ports. We've been having this problem for the last few months because of the foreign exchange problem. Serious discouragement of investment due to higher interest rates and new certificates with returns exceeding 20%. It's very difficult for a project to earn revenue or profit of 20%. So if there is 20% that's being offered on the deposits in the banks, then who's going to start the project? If you already have financial issues, you might close down and get out of it. Drop in the ranking, as I mentioned. And according to the IMF reports, the sovereign risk assessment, I mean, we do have a risk situation. The monitoring by the IMF for the agreement with the IMF, the amount itself is trivial. It's only $3 billion, but it's what's around it that is important, and they're being very aggressive in monitoring the compliance and in watching what is going to happen. And we have the high inflation. So these are dangers and repercussions. Now, what is the best scenario and what is the worst scenario and what is the way out? Okay, worst scenario if we continue to do that. Okay, and I think the rest does not need any description. The best scenario would be if we actually regain the foreign exchange market stability and end the black market through full compliance with the IMF, okay, and full flexibility of the exchange rate. If we succeed in our asset sale program, okay, we offered 32 public companies for sale. This has not happened yet. Okay, it's happening again very slowly. If it succeeds, this would be our better scenario, and the positive results of the regaining of the trust, let's put it this way, is going to bring a lot of things to follow: the increase in labor remittances, exports, a bit of control over inflation, and so on. But there is a downside even to the better scenario. And that's important, because as you start to adjust the foreign exchange market, the exchange rate might and is going to actually overshoot, and this is going to put a lot of pressure on the people, and is going to lead to huge inflation and a very high social cost. So there is a downside to it, and this would require large compensating by the government for the poor. But the biggest downside is what I like to call here the aspirin approach, okay, which is treating the problem in exactly the same way. So we're back to the same vicious circle. We would be out, but we are still in the same vicious circle. We are not solving the roots of the problem, okay? And there is also, of course, the issue of the army stepping out of the economy, stepping back, whether they will actually do that fully or not, to the extent that would make a difference. Between the worst scenario and the best scenario, there is a whole range of scenarios with different levels. But what does this all tell us? This is telling us a lot of things. It's telling us that the gradual approach, the way that we are handling the problem is not working, okay? This over-focus on the exchange rate and on the interest rate is not going to do the job. It's like a table that has 4 legs, and you are insisting on using 1 leg, and then you're surprised that the table is falling, okay? All the time, the government is addressing the symptoms of the problems and not the core. These are all the symptoms of the problem, okay? Following the aspirin approach for a quick relief of the problem. The present crisis situation and everything that happened before are all pointing to clear wrong decision-making by the government at all levels, okay? And this needs correction. And what this study is arguing is that the way we are managing the economy is what needs to change. Okay, we need serious institutional reform. This is what's behind the bad decision making. Okay, so the symptoms that we're seeing are just the tip of the iceberg. What's down there is the iceberg itself, and it's all institutional. Okay, and what I'm going to show in the rest of the presentation is the evidence-based analysis for how the nature of this institutional reform as being the only way out, and a specific proposal on how to go about it. Okay, the institutional reform is being addressed here, the definition in its broad sense, in the sense that it includes administrative, regulatory framework, administrative reforms, legal reforms, the whole thing. Any part of it alone does not do the job. Institutional reform requires looking at the structure of the state and the governance system and how decision making is being made. This is looking at a bunch of questions, which I'm not going to go through, okay, but they're just telling you, okay, when you assess the institutional situation in a country, you check who sets the priorities, okay, if decisions, if the mechanisms that are available to ensure that people's views are taken into account, are the policies based on evidence, based on data, yes or no, etc., etc., etc. These are the questions that are to be addressed if we are really assessing the institutional situation. In Egypt, there are key misconceptions, okay, in dealing with the institutional situation, and they're actually very, very serious. One of them was actually mentioned by Dr. Samir Maqdisi, and I will mention it in a second. One of the misconceptions that institutional reform is a long-term thing, okay? So we are not even looking at it. It's long-term. We are not, it's not going to bring the results now, so let's keep it on the side. And it's not true, okay, because there's so many things that can be actually done. Second thing, and this is the point that Dr. Samir made, and it's very true, the responsibility of the implementation of any proposed improvement in the system, okay, is always done by the same people who are benefiting from the system, which doesn't make any sense, okay? They cannot induce a change that will hurt them. It's only logical. The Egyptian pound, of course, is being treated like the virtue of the virgin girl. You cannot, well, I have to accept once, okay, right? you cannot reduce it. It should not go down. It's a very bad situation, and it's not. And of course, because of that, we've been treating it, we've been fixing it in a way that has been hurting the economy. Deepening of industry and import substitution means that we produce everything that we import. Again, wrong, okay? Because there are things that are not worth producing because they can be imported at a very low price. Digitalization, okay, is not automation. It's not automation of the existing processes. You have to change the existing processes completely and then do the automation. This is the digitalization. This is not what we are doing. And by the way, this applies to many countries, not just to Egypt, okay? KPIs are always looked at as targets, not even as things that need to be measured and corrected and so on. The infrastructure, all projects in infrastructure must be high priority. No, this is not true. Even within infrastructure, there are priorities, and they need to be addressed, and it has to be part of the country's plan. Bureaucracy is responsible for all problems. Bureaucracy is part of it. It's affected actually by the problem. When there is no system, this worker at the very end of the chain has degrees of freedom to make his own decisions and to make his own interpretations, and the problems emerge. So it's bigger than just focusing the problem on bureaucracy. Okay, we have a program called Takaful and Karama, which is looking at the poor, okay, and we are offering subsidies for housing and so on. And again, we are looking at these as if this is the solution for poverty. And finally, the increase in population, which we're always looking at as being the horror of all horrors. Actually, it's an asset. Europe, Asia, everybody is suffering because they don't have young people. We have young people. The question is how to use them, and it's also the increase in population is an outcome of poverty. Institutional obstacle, just to give glimpses, okay? We have the Minister of Communication. He's also the head of what's called the NTRA, which is the regulatory body. You cannot put the rules and play the game. It's very simple, okay? We have companies, public companies that are playing the role of regulatory, and at the same time, they are exporters, and they are, they are offered all the information by all private companies. So they are competing with them, knowing all their information, having the role as regulatory, and at the same time, it's conflicts of interest that are very clear. We have land. Egypt is living on 6% of its land. We have nothing more than land, yet we have a very big shortage in all land available for investment because there are over 20 organizations in charge of the land and making decisions. All of these issues are are institutional. Mentioned in details in the paper, okay, lots of issues here. I'm not going to address them for time consideration, but for each problem that is observed, we are looking at its negative impact, it's the institutional root of the problem, what government is doing right now, sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong, and what should be the solution. Just to give you a small hint, the budget, we do not have a unified budget. What is called government budget, okay, is a very small percentage. We have 59 public organizations that have their own budgets. So how can you possibly assess the debt situation correctly if each one of them is on his own? All of these are serious institutional issues. The suggested approach to reform that is being pushed by the study is to have an immediate emergency plan to regain the trust in the Egyptian economy and improve the public decision-making process significantly. This plan has 3 components. One of them is, of course, compliance with the full program of the IMF, and we don't have a choice, and it's a must that we do it, and it's useful that we do it, okay? But this has to come hand in hand with a comprehensive institutional reform and with building the preconditions for success of this whole thing. The 3 of them has to happen together. When you work on the preconditions for success along with the programs, you are capitalizing on every win that you make. Complying with the full IMF program by itself is going to take us back to the vicious circle again, including the privatization part. It's not enough to sell the companies. What is needed is to empower the private sector so that you would have growth and that you can grow out of the crisis and you can have, healthy growth. But simply being satisfied with selling of 32 companies, this is not going to do the trick, okay? So compliance with the IMF program by itself is not enough. It has to be those 3 together, all right? And the IMF, the institutional reform program that's suggested has 4 stages, okay? So we're talking about a 4-stage approach towards implementation of a comprehensive institutional reform program in Egypt. We're talking about full implementation of the IMF program, but that has to come with compensation by the government for the poor, okay, which means complete revision in the expenditure of the government on a lot of things, and looking at the asset sale program, as I mentioned, in a broader framework of empowerment of the private sector. Then we have the preconditions for success of the 2 programs. As implementation begins, okay, you build these so that you can capitalize on success. What is this 4-stage approach that I'm talking about? Stage 0, okay, is to lay the foundation of the improved policy making capabilities. And this means 2 things: data, okay, and the choice of decision makers. The correct choice of decision makers as needed, okay? These are the 2. Stage 1, facilitation of all procedures associated with ease of doing business, the ones related to investments and the one related to trade, and the improvements are easy to do, okay? And actually we've been doing in the last several months, we've been doing a detailed study about trade, import and export procedures, analyzing each and every step, and we found that you can cut the number of days of the process from 200 days to something like 13 days with easy measures. This is when I'm saying that institutional reform can be done. Stage 2, restructuring of a number of key entities regulating activities at the sectoral level, okay, like the Industrial Development Agency. All the Egyptians know the ones here, that all of them need work, so that we can push manufactured exports, which is something that we need very badly in order to help us earn a foreign exchange, and correct the misconception that in order to get out of our problem and solve the debt problem, we have to reduce our imports, okay? That we should target increasing our exports. And we found that to increase our exports, you have to allow imports of components that are needed. So looking at only one side and not looking at the other side is actually causing a lot problems, including also the fact that we seem to manage the debt as if it's a separate file. Let's manage the debt. You cannot manage the debt in its own right. It's part of the system. You cannot work on it alone. Stage number 3, and it's the hardest, yet it's the core of the problem, we need to restructure the cabinet, okay? And we need to have involvement of all stakeholders in the decision-making process, achieving checks and balances, and separating the planning from the execution, from the assessment. And what this figure is doing is trying to show the separation, okay? At this point, we have a minister that comes with a plan for changing the education system, for instance. Okay, he leaves. The next minister comes with a new plan for the education system. You cannot run a country like that. Okay, you need to have an actual strategic plan at the level of the country by those specialized councils under the cabinet. Okay, and the implementation is done by the different ministries, by the private sector, and by the civil society. The ministers who come are actually implementing an existing strategy, not creating something of their own. Okay, it doesn't fly. Now, this plan would have indicators. The indicators of performance need to be measured by something else. I'm putting here CAPMAS. It needs to be measured by institution outside them. Right now, the ministry is the one that plans, executes, and assesses itself and claps for itself as well. Okay? So we need the CAPMAS to do that, and then the reporting would go to the parliament and go to the president and go back for corrections. This is a system that should exist in order to correct things. A small example here. When you talk about the population problem, we have a population council. Our population council is under the Ministry of Health. This means right away that you are dealing with the population problem as a problem of having children, when actually it's a lot more than that. If you deal with it this way, then you would bring it up, you would take it out of the Ministry of Health, and then Ministry of Health, Education, everybody, okay, is working on the target. So this separation of planning, execution, and assessment would take care of things. The preconditions for success, they are very important and they are not easy. This is why they have to be built on as we go on. First one, creating grounds for political desirability of state stepping back and private sector stepping forward to the benefit of all. Okay, and we actually have grounds for this because the performance of the army companies that were operating is not that well. Okay, and it is being seen, okay, by the system. All right.
15 minutes.
Yes, خلاص I'm finishing.
دلوقتي بقت 45 minutes.
45?
Yes.
I'm going to finish. No, it's not 45 على فكرة. أنت بتضحك علي. Okay. All right. If you don't notice that it's long, then I'm okay. All right. Push for the implementation steps of what's the state ownership doctrine. This is a very big step for Egypt. The elephant in the room is actually put in a doctrine. We have a doctrine that came out in December 2022 to talk about stepping out of the state from the investments. But it's not, this is a step, but it's not enough that you stay there. There has to be a committee that's responsible for the implementation, and it cannot be from the same people for the argument that I mentioned. We need to enforce decentralization, capitalize on the silver lining of the crisis, that we have to comply with the IMF program. So let's benefit from it fully and not treat it as the aspirin, and empower the authorities that are in charge of championing the change and not ask the existing beneficiaries to implement the program. If we do that, okay, and this is why the optimistic scenario is an if scenario, if we actually do that, we are going to get out of the crisis, regain the trust, and increase the chances for investment. We will be really correctly, okay, using a point, growing out of the crisis. This is what we need. We will be able to attract. There are lots of opportunities of investment that Egypt can benefit from, and by so doing, we can get on what is called the high road for development and not the low road for development, which means using our full potential without growing, you know, in a very, very modest way, relying on subsidies and on resource-based exports, etc., etc. We can do all that if we actually make those corrections. Thank you.
Abla, thank you to Dr. Leila also. And we have two distinguished commentators, but who already had talked a lot this morning and gave us all of their wisdom. So I hope that the remaining wisdom that they will give us will be concentrated. So let's start with Reza. The floor is yours.
I was told 10 minutes, and I was told to comment just on Egypt, so I'm going to be very quick. And I'm going to try to make 3 points. The first point I want to talk about is the the institutional and governance reforms that Abla spoke about. And I'm going to try to add to it. I'm not going to try to claim to improve upon what is the right recommendation for Egypt. My second 2 points are going to be more in the context of when I saw Abla's paper and then I got to read about Egypt recently, I've been thinking about the market sentiment right now and why the market sentiment in Egypt, despite having an IMF program, has not improved. It improved, but then it fell. And what does it say about perceived debt sustainability? So let me just begin with the first point, and that is about what are the reform actions that are needed in Egypt. I defer to Abla. There are many other people here who know a lot more about Egypt than I do. I want to emphasize that the recommendations that were in the paper, like on slide 47 that you were showing, which is how the cabinet's rules may need to change, I think effort in that spirit is very welcome. I do not know if that is the right model for Egypt. You would know more, but I think reforms in this direction, I think, go a long way. And I say this from my own experience of having served. I never knew these things when I was at the IMF. It seemed that you just make a recommendation and things would happen. Once I left and I was doing public office myself, I realized that you need to think as much about how decisions are being made and how you want that process to be institutionalized. In that vein, I wanted to offer a suggestion, which is that in many countries, the fiscal deficit often drives the current account deficit. And in fact, we saw a chart here earlier in either the Tunisia case study or the Morocco case study, which showed a very tight correlation between fiscal and balance of payment deficits. It's the same relationship in Pakistan as well, that the fiscal drives the current account. And my one suggestion was to also think about such as the rules such as in Chile. Now, Chile has a very advanced structural fiscal balance rule, which has been credited for having them achieved sustainability over a long period of time. But there are perhaps simpler things where the size of the budget deficit is a decision that can perhaps be delegated to a council, almost an independent council, just like we talk of the concept of central bank independence. And that is a decision that is done based by technocrats, but then reported to a higher body. The reason I mention this is, from the case of Pakistan, from many other countries that I know, the size of the fiscal deficit often depends a lot on just the identity of who the finance minister is. And we want to insulate the long-term trend of the fiscal deficit from just the pure political developments. So my point is that there can be consideration of systems where the level of the deficit is insulated from the political situation, but the allocation of the deficit follows very much the typical budget process where the elected government decides where the priorities should be within the overall envelope. And perhaps that's a way to strike a balance between preserving fiscal sustainability, having a clear path on the size of the deficit, but also having that representative democracy shows in terms of what the allocations are. Now, this is what I wanted to just comment on the first part, which is about different institutional and governance mechanisms to achieve sustainability. I now want to transition to the other 2 points that I want to make, which is now speaking a bit more about Egypt and talking about market sentiment. And my point of departure is the following. So as I mentioned this morning, I was here in Cairo during 2017 to 2019 in the then IMF-supported program. Now, when I look at this current program and it started in 27th of October, and the CDS spreads were then around 1,300 when it started. They subsequently fell, and they fell to as much as 750 by January. However, since January, they've been rising, and they're right now 1,750, which is higher than what the level was when the IMF program was announced. And if I compare that to the previous big program, the one in November 2016, when that program was announced, just before that, the CDS spreads were around 500. And then they fell more or less steadily, reaching about 250 basis points, so nearly halved in about 2 years. So I have been wondering and thinking about why is it that despite the announcement of an IMF program, and as Abla was saying, that an IMF program sends the right signal, and the IMF's role is to try to catalyze investment from other sources and to give this signal of good housekeeping. So why is it that despite that? Now, some of it could just be, as Abla was saying, that it's because some of the actions that had to be done have not been done. I don't know, because I don't have any inside information. But I want to actually talk about two aspects of the program itself that have struck me that I think may be contributing, aside from whatever prior actions or conditions that the authorities have to do. One has to do with the size of the program, and the other, which is closely related, has to do with how the financing gap is being filled. And now let me talk about both very, very quickly. The first is the size of the program. How much is the IMF lending to Egypt right now? Now, in most programs, that is a very important number, because just by deciding how much resources the IMF is committing, the IMF is putting credibility behind its own signal that we have confidence in the reform program of the country, that we can put a lot of money behind this. So this program right now, as you may know, is $3 billion. Now, for IMF, the way it thinks of the right amount of lending is in percent of quota, and quota is roughly each country's economic standing in the IMF. So the right way to think about it is in percent of quota. In percent of quota, this program comes to 115% of quota. Just the last IMF program was about 4 times the size of this. It was 400% of quota. So my first question is it that the IMF has in fact underwhelmed the market by not having gone with a strong enough signal? And when I compare this program to some other cases, the size of the program is much less. So for instance, if you look at the IMF's support programs in the European cases, in Portugal, Greece, and Ireland, does anybody want to guess how much was the size of the program there if Egypt was 100 or 400% of access? Isaac says 500. So it was between 2,000 and 3,000% of quota. Okay? So it's a huge difference that you have a program which is 100 or 400% of quota. You have Greece, which was 3,200% of quota. You have Ireland, which was 2,300% of quota. And you have Portugal, which was also 2,300% of quota. So the one message I just want to leave for everybody is how much of this might be a question also to the IMF. Have they gotten it right in terms of the strength of the signal that they are sending to the market? And the way I think about it is that it is most helpful for the market to know that if the country authorities are doing everything that the IMF is saying, then actually one should be very clear and put more money on the table as a credible signal. So that was my first point about the size of the program. The second closely related point is about how the financing gap is being filled, how much money is being provided by the IMF, and how much by other sources. In the European programs, there was a very conscious decision to take the issuer out of the markets for 3 years. If the country was doing everything, and there were also tough conditions over there, if the country was doing all these tough conditions, which included lowering the popularity of the government, then the country would be protected. It didn't really need to go to the markets at all for 3 years. So it had a buffer period. Here, in this case, that is not the case. And if you look at the most recent program, this is $3 billion. And then the IMF report says that this is supposed to generate an additional $14 billion. And a significant chunk of that is supposed to come from the privatization program. I'm going to end on that, which is that in my mind, I'm not sure if filling the financing gap with privatization proceeds may be is necessarily such a good idea. Not because I'm opposed to privatization. I think privatization and state-owned enterprise reform is a very good idea. The question is, there are tensions when you privatize state-owned assets, and do you want to do it in a rush to fill a gap, or in a country where privatization is already not a good name, do you want to make sure you take the time to lay the foundations for building a domestic ownership of it, making sure all the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted? This is dealing with public money, public assets. You don't want public officials to be questioned ex post whether the process was correct or not. So you want to lay all the right foundations if you want to change the psyche or of the people that actually privatization is a good thing. Guess what? We did it, and we brought good value back to Egypt. So I am closing then on this point that perhaps a way to think about doing structural reforms like privatization better is to have it as part of the conditionality, but not have the money to fill the financing gap. So perhaps the IMF could lend that same amount, still have conditionality that so many SOEs have to be privatized, but then that reduces the pressure and the market signal is not confused. Markets then know that so long as structural reform is happening, conditions are being met, there is no doubt about meeting the financing gap. So really liked my 3 points. Really liked the emphasis on institutional and structural reforms. Encourage people to think about separating the size of the deficit from the allocation of government spending. One can be a political process, one can perhaps be shielded from politics. Second point about thinking about whether, in addition to whatever the authorities have to do, whether there is good arguments to take to the IMF to think about, number one, the size of the program, especially compared to some other cases. And number two, is this the right way to fill the financing gap, including through privatization proceeds? Thank you.
Adnan.
Reza and I kind of divided the labor, so I'm going to be speaking mostly about Tunisia. But I do subscribe to everything he said, especially about the size of the program. But I would like to stress the size of the program is also a reflection of the assessment, right or wrong, of the IMF, of the willingness of the authorities to do reforms. And as in our language, meaning, or at least I should say their language now, the IMF, the issue is, do the authorities really want to change, or is this a transactional relationship? Okay. Now, on Tunisia. I read the paper first. I enjoyed it very much. Tunisia has had some specific characteristics compared with all the other countries. It has gone through a transitional to democracy. Incomplete, but it has. The result has been that it does not yet have the institutions to resolve political and economic differences. It's not a, well, at least until recently, it was not a dictatorship, right? It does have it is the country with perhaps the most powerful labor union in the entire region, okay? And they are very competent in dealing with economic issues. They come from a particular viewpoint, but they are serious and sensible people from that perspective. Because of the political situation, the state became the largest employer and a provider of subsidies. Even Joe Stiglitz started complaining about the state in Tunisia hiring so many people. Therefore, the paper is right about pointing to some of the issues that have been behind this rise. Believe it or not, there were discussions with the G7, with others, about providing Tunisia with more money. The problem was simple. Tunisia was going through a democratic transition. It needed a longer period of program with much less conditionality. Nobody was willing to do that. Especially after the events in Egypt shifted the attention of the G7 from transition to democracy to stability and security. Okay, we had very long discussions, and after which I promised myself I will never use the term Marshall Plan anymore. Okay. Next, it suffered because of the regional powers with money didn't like the transition. They did not provide sufficient support. And there were other accidents, such as terrorism, etc. Having said this, we are at a point of institutional deadlock and, frankly, transition to a dictatorship. Okay? If I were the IMF, I would consider this as a factor, whether the political system can deliver reforms or not. There was some positive news coming out of the IMF today that they are working on details. But me and my colleagues, when we say details, sometimes we mean you have to cross the Nile. Okay, so I'm not counting on money coming in soon. I'll start with your scenario C. Scenario C makes some very sensible goals it lays out. One can question, where do you think those growth rates are going to come from? What is Tunisia going to produce tomorrow that it doesn't today? How it's going to, for example, benefit from the changes in geopolitics such that it could either itself directly fit itself into the new de-risking of global value chains, or maybe through other countries in the region do so. One thing that really scared me about this scenario C was this issue of accounting approach to fiscal policy, which I raised this morning. People like me, whenever they hear somebody saying accounting, we interpret it, maybe that's not what is meant, as people do not take seriously a budget constraint. As simple as that. It means that you want to go soft on public enterprises, which are a core problem in Tunisia, and the government, where it can now and has been borrowing from the central bank. In one of the discussions, there was a suggestion that there could be more borrowing from the domestic market. That is true. But the spreads are low in part because the government has been borrowing from the central bank. These are not real spreads. Frankly, the debt is unsustainable. Okay? As you recognize under scenario A. And the country is going to go to the wall very quickly. With scenario B, there is a possibility of muddling through. No more. Growth rates of 1% are muddling through. Even scenario B is very, if I understood it correctly, is quite ambitious in terms of foreign financing. Okay? If I were the Tunisian authorities, I suggest sitting down with the creditors. In the case of Tunisia, they are bilateral mostly and multilateral. And some of the reason Tunisia was able to borrow in the past was for part of it. And I don't want to exaggerate. The United States provided a guarantee. They're not going to do so under the current political circumstances. I would immediately agree to a program with IMF, and I would sit with the official creditors and ask for a rescheduling. They very likely will not give debt relief in terms of debt forgiveness, but they could reprofile the debt. Official creditors generally do not give too much face value cuts. The multilaterals will not. Okay? But consideration could be given to a complete profiling of this. Because even under scenario B, which is probably a more reasonable one, the chances of default are very strong. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adnan. So let me open it for 10 minutes of questions and answers. I already have Dr. Alia who wants to speak, but since I am chairing, I have the right to the first question. Yes, and then you're second. My question actually is on public investments. Because when I looked at your presentation, well, it shows private investments coming down, public investments going up. And I looked at, I don't know the details of the public investment program in Egypt, but I've looked at many public investment programs around the world, and some of those public projects, I would call more like public consumption rather than public investment, in the sense that nobody expects much of a return on those, and that they're more prestige type projects. So how much, to what extent is this kind of thing true in the Egyptian case? I don't know. So this was my question. Now, Dr. Alia, please.
Okay. I'll raise the voice of the microphone. Actually, first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Abla very much. It was a very comprehensive, very realistic presentation. And I would like to comment on the comment of Dr. Reza when he said, why is it that the IMF program is not giving the right signals despite of it being an IMF program? It's not despite, because it is an IMF program. And the implementation, it's not despite, you understand the difference between them. Because it is an IMF program, the question is, who are these signals going to? If you're talking about the government or the IMF itself, this is a story. If you're talking about signals to the public, it's a totally different story. When the program in the people's perception is related to devaluation, extremely high inflation rates that were never witnessed before, how would the perceptions be? It's absolutely realistic that the people would have pessimistic perception of the program. Standards of living became, inflation rate is very high. It affected the majority of population, if not all of the population. Cost of living became much more higher. So what kind of expectations do we get out of that? I'm not talking about government, I'm talking about the population. So not despite of the program, but because of it, because of the implications of the program. If it was managed in a better way, so as not to, and I'll give an example of an IMF program that was managed in a much more better way, that of 1991-92. This program, when it was an IMF program, Stabilization and Structural Adjustment Program. When it started in 1991, the inflation rate was 20% or 21%, and with the implementation of the program that was really very carefully implemented, the inflation rate dropped down from 20 or 21% to like 2% in 1996-97. So this made the population feel better. So once the program is associated with an improvement in the living standards, the perceptions will be positive, not negative. Thank you very much.
To deviate a little bit from this IMF things, because I remember our colleague Dr. Madhat Hussein, when he was, this in the 90s, when he was reforming the banking sector in Egypt, the IMF, they are coming and dictate him, do this and do that. He said they are taking you to the, slippery slope. Once you take one, you go. So he said, I was resisting that. I tell them, don't tell me what to do. I know what I really want to do for the country. So just, and then he said, I took the initiative and made a greater contribution. The idea that people are selling the asset, this is a very dangerous proposition, because they will pressure you to devalue and they are taking the cheaper assets. So the country like Egypt, where you have a bulk of the people are poor, and then the state will be liquidated from its assets, then they are going to rely on taxes, and the poor will be even get more poor. So this is more working in the favor of the creditors to get the collaterals and etc. So I'm just thinking that Egypt is too big to fail, and I totally agree with the idea that the public projects need to stop, because I left 3 years ago. I came in, I found too many highways. So probably those are diminishing return, probably need to stop those ones. And that's the side that need to be working out. But the idea of selling the asset is very dangerous for a country like Egypt.
And Tunisia is not very far behind. So my question concerning the size issue, and that question I don't know whom, maybe our friends from the Adnan to answer. It is my impression that the size is being determined by the lending into arrears. The IMF is sizing the programs depending on what the countries are expected to reimburse the IMF. So they are financing just enough to reimburse the outstanding debts to the IMF, and that's it. It's to cover their backs, essentially, and it's not anything else. That is my impression, but I don't know. I have done the calculation for Tunisia, 1.9 billion. It's about the same amount of money that Tunisia is supposed to reimburse the IMF for the next 4 years. I haven't done the calculations for Egypt, but I wonder what is not the same.
I'd like to ask Dr. Reza Baqir, because I agree with him totally, why it is then that the assets of Egypt, which we've known for years now, they've been accumulating so as to sell, were not recognized by the IMF in its decisions on how much to lend Egypt.
My only question, I guess, has to do with the vision of how to stimulate the economy from the private sector's perspective, other than selling assets. And I don't see a vision there. And my question is it solely tied to reducing debt and borrowing money just to get out of the debt trap, or I don't know. It's just a question to that effect. And then the last point has to do with we talk about the private sector, but it seems that the definition here is very narrow in how we look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a clarifying question to Dr. Abla. You mentioned the mega projects. And I'm a bit confused about where the money comes from, the MENA project. Are they classified as public expenditure? Do they appear in our public? Where are they? Where is the, do we know? Because you mentioned them and it seems very naive.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mustafa, for that question. Look, funds access levels are determined by the country's borrowing, balance of payment needs, their ability to repay, then how much fund resources are at risk. When we lend, they lend. I keep still saying we. When they lend, okay? So you're absolutely right. A factor that goes into these decisions is the capacity to repay the fund. The fund is a financial institution, and its risk management policies, like anyone, requires to be calculating and reporting in every staff report for a program how much is at risk. Now, having said this, Egypt's program has been large, but compared to others, it has not been large. For those people who know who are in this business, like Reza, he could immediately tell this program, from at least the market perspective, is underfunded. Having said that, there isn't going to be much more funding unless there is some huge political pressure for shareholders, and I don't see it. The fund does do strange things sometimes, for example, lend to Ukraine right now, but those are specific circumstances, and I'm not defending them or justifying them. But the access level to Egypt was a function of the perceived, right or wrong, commitment of the authorities and their track record with those issues. There was also a comment about the 91-92 program. I was board member of the joint IMF World Bank staffs that did that. That program was successful, but it also became the benchmark for what not to do with conditionality. The reform matrix, I remember, was like 20 pages. Ms. Hebo Handusa, who may not remember me, but I met her 30 years ago, I remember making the point. And those kind of programs are not going to happen anymore either, with so much conditionality. And believe you me, you should thank God.
Thank you very much for all the questions. Let me answer the first one about the public investment. They are closer to what you describe as public consumption than actual public investment, because they do not bring a return. They are all projects related to infrastructure. They are relying a lot on loans, okay? And there will be no return coming except many, many years through private investment in neighboring areas. And the problem with those projects is the fact that many of them are not necessary, and they were not urgent to be done now. So economics is all about priorities. They are good, all those bridges, okay, they are good, but they were not necessary. So this, I hope this answers your question a little bit. On Dr. Ali's comment on the IMF program, it's important that we remember that we are the ones that go to the IMF because of our poor performance. It's not the other way around. This is important. The reason why the IMF, the program in 1991 was successful, it has a lot to do with the government that was there at the time. They did not comply completely with the conditions of the IMF. And there were delays in the cancellation of the debt with the Paris Club, which was the condition for that program, because they wanted to take it slowly. So the implementation is actually the responsibility of the government. The problem that we are having right now, that on one side, we know what needs to be done by the IMF, but we are not taking measures to make sure that the impact is not strong and bad for the people. For instance, you are not encouraging the exports, even though you know you need the exports. Okay, on the private sector, and there is no vision there. No, actually, the vision is actually very clear. It's not about the privatization itself. The privatization is simply selling a number of companies. It's about putting it in a broader framework where private sector is empowered. Private sector is not empowered by paying the debt. Private sector is empowered by improving the business environment, by solving their problems. Okay, and here this entire analysis about the institutional obstacles is looking at the suffering of the private sector and the unfair competition that they are facing with projects that are coming from the state. How are they financing? It shows in our budget, all of our public investment is going in that direction. There is a heavy reliance on loans. On the new cities, they're using the revenue that's coming from المجتمعات العمرانية. I'm not sure what the name in English. Okay, it used to be part of the budget. Now it's out of the budget, and its revenues are all going for the building of the new cities. So it's everywhere, but it does show. Okay.
Thank you very much. Dr. Abla, I don't know if Dr. Leila is still with us and if she wants to add something.
No, she's not with us, and she asked me to take the questions for her, but not to answer them.
You can still answer it. I'm sure. Okay. So with that, let me end this session. Thank you all very much.
Okay, actually, the last session is supposed to involve our two distinguished commentators, but I think for the interest of time, right? And since we heard a lot from them, and we were really, quite informed now about the political economy of the IMF and the debt issues and everything. So we will devote this to two speakers. I would like to invite Ramiro Albrieu. Ramiro is a principal investigator in CEPIC Economic Development Program. It's an Argentine network that work in the Global South. Ramiro is a principal investigator on CEPIC Economic Development Program. He is an economist and professor at the University of Buenos Aires. He is an organizing member of the Task Force Technological Change and the Future of Work of the Group of 20 and affinity group of think tanks of the G20, coordinator of the global project, The Future of Work in the Global South. And by the way, ERF was involved on this project under the leadership of Ramiro and CEPIC. He's an associate researcher at the Center for State and Society Studies and the Commitment to Equity Institute at Tulane University in the USA. So Ramiro, if you are online, would like to invite you to give us a brief remarks between 5 to 10 minutes.
So hi everyone, thanks for inviting me here. I think that I learned a lot from your case studies. I am coordinating or working on a project trying to understand sustainability, not only from a purely short-term fiscal perspective, but also trying to add elements of social sustainability and environmental or intertemporal sustainability. We are working with country teams in Latin America and in Africa. But of course, in Latin America, the situation is different because we are not, well, I'm from Argentina. So leaving aside Argentina, the rest of Latin America is not having problems with their balance of payments, So in these countries, we are trying to find new ways of incorporating environmental and social sustainability to traditional sustainability analysis. But of course, once you start thinking about situations such as the one is Argentina is living, we need to understand the trade-offs, between fiscal sustainability and, for example, again, environmental sustainability and so on. So in the project, we are trying to mix all these ideas, trying to think of a framework for, having a broader perspective on sustainability. But what I want to do in my 5 minutes is just to try to reflect from Argentina on what I just heard, from all your analysis from different countries. Of course, Argentina is a country that, we know a lot about crisis because, I study crisis, but also I have the crisis in my skin, from very early on, from the 80s. So when you talk about the 80s, Argentina now is living the 80s. We have high inflation, we have foreign exchange controls, so we have parallel markets for the US dollar. We have quasi-fiscal deficits, we have financial repression, and we are under an IMF supported program. So in a way we are, I'm just also watching, movie from the 80s just to live the full experience, because Argentina is really living in the 80s. And we are failing. We are not stabilizing the balance of payments. We are not adjusting the economy, and we are not finding new sources of growth. So it's a case where we are having, for the last, I must say, 10 years, we are trying to stabilize, adjust, and grow, and we are failing. So it's kind of a lab for thinking about what not to do, right? So it's really sad to say that coming from Argentina, but that's the reality. So let me just finish with 4 comments, thinking about Argentina and your case studies. The first one is that, of course, we know, but we need to remember that reforms can go wrong. In a way, reforming an economy is like walking on a minefield, right? So you need political support. You need to listen to every voice in your economy. You need to have this feedback between society and the government, right? For example, in Uruguay, we have a lot of experiences of reforming with a lot of public or citizens' involvement, in reforming, for example, state-owned enterprises. Well, in Argentina we don't, so in a way we are still struggling not only with reforming things, but with coping with failed reforms from the past. So, reform is kind of a really tricky and complex thing. The second lesson from Argentina is that details matter a lot. So local conditions are critical, and once we are in an IMF-supported program, we need to bring local issues into the table, because for them it's kind of, we are an upper middle income, and this is it. No, we are much more complex than an upper middle income. For example, structural issues, the stock structure is totally different across countries, or the set of behaviors and incentives. For example, I'm always checking the value of the dollar in the parallel market. During our conference, I checked this like 25 times, just this morning. So we need to understand these behaviors. We need to check the existing institutions and players that are in the field, because it's totally different across countries. So local conditions are really, critical to think about engaging with the IMF and so on. Third, we cannot take institutional learning for granted. Governments, maybe they don't learn across crises. So, we researchers, maybe we learn about Now capital controls are important. In the past, maybe they weren't important. But governments maybe are not learning at all. So maybe we need to get back to the basics sometimes to explain the risks of, I don't know, freeing, the capital accounts and so on. And finally, I think that you have been discussing that a lot, but I think it's important to understand that IMF is not a rational creditor. It's a complex institution with its own political economy, as you have been discussing. But in Argentina, that's totally, that's really something really to take into account. Because you have the bureaucracy, but then you have politics inside the IMF. And in our case, being an upper middle income country, there's no blueprint from the IMF. So it's all about negotiating with different politicians, So again, thinking about the IMF more as an institution with its own problems, with its own incentives, with its own, balance of powers inside institutions is really, I think that is critical. And just regarding that, just let me finish by saying that I think that we will see an IMF more concerned with balance of payments. And then all other issues that they were trying to incorporate regarding growth, inclusive growth, and all these issues, I think that, okay, maybe they, in a way, they failed to try to have a broader view on how to help an economy. And I think that they will move more for returning to the basics of the IMF, balance on payments, some discussion on fiscal deficits and structural reform, but I think that they will not go for trying to enrich their view on sustainability by including, environment, social issues, and so on. I think that we will see a more, we can say, IMF from the beginning, from Bretton Woods and all these discussions. That's my view on that. So thanks for this time.
Thank you very much, Ramiro, for sharing your perspective. Much appreciated. And I hope that you also find the time to continue with us for the next 3 days. But we really appreciate your interest and participation. Argentina provides important lessons for our region. And I would assume also there are lessons to be had from this region for Argentina. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Ishaq and to thank him for actually bringing us to where we are and to listen some parting marching orders and guidance from you, perhaps?
Yeah, we need to talk a little bit about the management of the project since all the authors are here. First, I want to really thank the authors for working very hard over a short period of time. I want to thank IDRC for financing us, but with a strict limit on time, which turned out to be useful because, these are urgent matters. And so we had to produce these papers very fast. The authors worked very fast, I think between October, November, and today, and we have pretty good drafts. Now, out of this, we're going to produce policy briefs, short policy briefs to really try to influence the situation on the ground, which in some countries is very urgent and critical. And also, I'm going to ask you to try to reduce and organize those papers more strategically as chapters of a book. And we will also ask the discussants to organize their very good discussion also into short notes, because I think it's going to be important to pull this together now to have more of a regional impact. Remember, we started with a commission on the region following those papers, so the whole body of work is important, especially that we're entering a period, we know things are not going to be resolved in a year or two. This is probably a lost generation in front of us in many countries and difficulties. And so this is kind of the opening salva, and to put good ideas on the table, I think, is important. Now, one more, and I'm sure you have very long text. There is lots you can do with it nationally. I'm sure you are already in some countries, and we'll encourage you to do more in others. We will also have a session at we're calling it the Macron June Conference Summit in Paris, which we're organizing with Ramiro and other colleagues from Africa. So all together we would go around the debt crisis in many countries and what we can extract in terms of global lessons. So we'll talk with the authors very soon. Now, I don't want to take much time on the issues. Just to remind you, I mean, we will speak about them in the plenary tomorrow as well. The Commission report basically had 4 big messages. First, that the status quo in many of our countries, in most of the countries, is not sustainable, and I think all your studies show that this is the case in literally every country. The status quo is not sustainable. A second conclusion was that austerity alone is not sufficient. Austerity is going to be needed. There is no escape, not enough resources, but that alone, without showing the end of the tunnel, would lead to instability, social instability. I think many of you got there, but not with the kind of brutal honesty that we wanted. So I would push you to go more into the bad scenarios about how the tension could actually play out, so that I think this is part of making an effective case. Third, that growth opportunities do exist, and that compared to the 80s, in many countries the arithmetics, the political arithmetics of reform or no reform may have changed. And so let's bring out, strategically at least, what are those growth opportunities? It has to do with the fact that in the 80s the private sector was barely nascent, now it is there, so giving more space to the private sector will lead to more gains, especially that is very repressed, but other things also dealing with climate change is one of them, digitalization is one of them. These are issues we will deal with in different sessions in the coming days. And to integrate them just at a strategic level and see to what extent that arithmetic has changed would be useful. Then there is a sort of a taboo issue that not only the discussion raised, which is to what extent is that restructuring needed? If not now, soon, is it possible to do a rescheduling? To what extent can domestic debt become cheaper with capital controls? To open the range of the discussion into things we don't discuss in normal times, but we start discussing when there is financial stress. So, if I don't push you too much on this, because, I know from the Lebanese situation, before, when the financials is tense, there are things you don't like to talk about. So maybe we'll ask the discussant to speak about that, and we'll include the discussions. And the fourth message was that reform is a political job. It's not that politicians care about security and technocrats do economic reform. You need to build a coalition. And so, perhaps in your papers, identifying the gainers and the losers from reform would be useful, or at least finding the proper angle for an understanding of the political economy would be very useful, even if it's not a full treatment. So that's all that I want to say today, and just to thank you again all for the hard work and the discussants for having come from far away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.